Priscilla Castellano Rowe didn't start with an insult. She started with a kick. In the grand hall of the Aldermere Hotel, beneath a gilded, vaulted ceiling, surrounded by senators, bankers, and the cameras of the Chicago press, Priscilla raised the toe of her heel and kicked over the bucket of the woman kneeling to scrub the floor at the foot of the podium. The metal bucket flew from Rosalind Vance's hands, rolled twice across the marble, and struck a table leg. Gray water spread over the red carpet, slid under the hems of evening gowns, and reached the leather shoes of the most powerful people in the city. A few steps away sat Priscilla's 14-year-old daughter, quietly holding her mother's velvet coat, her head lowered in silent shame as she watched. 300 conversations died at once, and for one terrible second, everyone saw something they could not explain. The cleaning woman pushed herself up, picked up the bucket, and quietly knelt down to start again, but her back was straight, like someone praying, not like someone begging. That was the first shock. The second was that nobody stopped it. Priscilla had been tormenting her all evening. She said the woman's cracked hands were dirtying the crystal. She made her mop the same spotless patch of floor 3 times. She dropped a wine-stained napkin at her feet and told her to pick it up, because that was her job. Everyone saw. Nobody helped. Only 3 elderly guests at table 7 weren't laughing, and they weren't looking at Priscilla. When Rosalind reached for the bucket, her sleeve rode up, and all 3 of them froze at the sight of the hook-shaped scar on the back of her right hand. And Emmett Castellano stood on the mezzanine, his gloved left hand resting on the stone railing, his dark eyes fixed on her with a focus far too intense to be casual. In that city, no one dared contradict him, yet he said nothing, and that silence made people despise him. Because if a man with that much power wouldn't protect a woman being humiliated inside his own hotel, then what was all that power for? If this story touched your heart, leave a like so we know you're still listening. Share it with someone you believe deserves far more kindness than life has given them. And don't forget to subscribe, because every week we bring you a story to remind you that a person's dignity is never measured by the work they do. The party tried to return to what it had been, but it couldn't. The strings kept flowing, glasses kept touching, smiles kept rising in all the proper places, and yet everyone could hear the wheels of the supply cart rolling slowly over the granite at the far end of the room, and no one could focus on their own conversation anymore. Rosalind Vance worked as though nothing had happened. She changed the water, wrung out the mop, moved behind the row of columns so she wouldn't cross the guests' line of sight, and whenever someone came near, she stepped back to let them pass before they had the chance to notice her. That was precisely what Priscilla Castellano Rowe couldn't bear. Cruel people needed something to harvest. They needed tears, or anger, or any sign at all that the wound had found its way into flesh. Rosalind gave her nothing, and that emptiness kept growing inside Priscilla's chest until it became the only thing she could think about. She set her glass down on the table. She moved through the crowd, breaking away from the circle of people praising her, and stopped Rosalind in the corner of the room, where the service corridor opened and the chandelier light couldn't reach. A few people turned to watch, then a few more. In rooms like this, people caught the scent of blood faster than the scent of wine. Priscilla blocked the way and tipped her chin toward the gilded, vaulted ceiling above. Did she know how much the room she was standing in was worth? She asked, her voice just loud enough for the nearest 10 people to hear. Rosalind leaned the mop against the wall. She lifted her head, and for the first time that evening, she looked directly into the eyes of the woman standing before her. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "I clean it 6 nights a week." The answer wasn't insolent. It was so calm that it became something else, something Priscilla had never had placed in her hands before a crowd. And she understood at once that if she allowed those words to remain untouched for 2 more seconds, the entire room would remember them longer than they remembered her. So she slapped her. The sound was sharp and thin, breaking through the silence between 2 notes, and the music stopped as though even the musician had been startled. 300 people turned at once. At table number 7, Judson Hark remained rooted to his chair, his hands clenched tightly on his knees, watching the truth unfold with heavy, knowing eyes. Rosalind's head tilted to one side, then returned to its place. She didn't raise a hand to her cheek. She didn't step back. She only breathed out very slowly. And in that moment, the people standing nearest saw something that unsettled them in a way they couldn't explain. This woman wasn't surprised. She didn't look like someone who had just been slapped for the first time in her life. She looked like someone who was counting. "You've gotten perfume on your hand," Rosalind said softly. holding out the dry cloth toward Priscilla. It was the worst thing she could have said, because it wasn't a reply. It was kindness, and kindness, when offered to someone who had just struck you, carried a power to destroy that no curse could ever match. Blood rushed into Priscilla's face. She could no longer see the room, no longer see the cameras, no longer remember who she was or where she stood. She saw only the white cloth being offered to her. And she swung a second time, much harder than before, throwing the full weight of her body into it. Rosalind shifted half a step, only half a step. She didn't retreat, didn't move aside, didn't raise a hand to block the blow. It was merely a movement so small that most of the people there would later swear she had remained perfectly still. Priscilla's hand tore through the empty air where Rosalind's face had been an instant before. There was nothing to stop the force of her arm. Her upper body pitched forward. The narrow heel of her shoe slid across the thin film of gray water, still lying on the granite. The very puddle she herself had spilled onto the floor less than an hour earlier, and the floor rose to meet her as emeralds struck one another with a brittle clatter. The entire hall went silent. Not a glass, not a breath. Priscilla lay there, one side of her hair pulled loose from its elegant knot, her clutch resting 2 steps away. And for the first 3 seconds, she didn't understand what had just happened to her. But there was one thing the entire room understood at the same time, and that was what sent cold through every spine. Rosalind Vance hadn't touched her. Not with a single finger. There had been no shove. She stood exactly where she had been, both arms hanging at her sides, the dry cloth still in her right hand. People could forgive a blow returned. They understood retaliation. They were even relieved by it, but no one in that room knew what to call what they had just witnessed, because it had been too precise to be luck and too restrained to be an accident. 2 security guards pushed through the crowd, and one of them reached for Rosalind's arm. Then, from the mezzanine, that voice came down, low and slow, no louder than it needed to be. "Don't touch her." The reaching hand stopped in midair. Emmett Castellano still stood in the same place beside the stone railing, his gloved left hand utterly motionless. He didn't look at the 2 guards. He didn't look at the woman lying on the floor of his own house. He looked only at Rosalind, and the entire hall suddenly realized that all evening long, he hadn't been looking anywhere else. Emmett Castellano descended the staircase. He didn't hurry. He moved like a man who knew the room would wait for him, and the room did, 300 people standing perfectly still, as one man walked down 20 stone steps without anyone daring to clear their throat. He passed Priscilla as she pushed herself upright with one hand. He didn't stop. He didn't bend down. He didn't even turn his head toward her. And later, when people told the story of that night, the detail they mentioned most wasn't the fall, but those 2 footsteps passing her by. He stopped in front of Rosalind Vance. Only at that close distance could people see that he stood a full head taller than she did, and only at that close distance could they see that she didn't look up at him the way a servant looked at a master. She looked at him the way someone looked at a door she had stood before for a very long time and still hadn't decided whether to open. "Are you hurt?" he asked. His voice was deep, slow, and so quiet that only those within 3 steps could hear him. "No, sir," Rosalind replied. Those 2 words, "No, sir," should have restored everything to its old and proper order, master and servant, those above and those below, and the entire room should have breathed in relief because the world had been put back into place. But they didn't have that effect. She hadn't spoken them in the voice of someone who was afraid. She had spoken them like a person maintaining a distance she herself had chosen, not one that someone else had forced upon her. Then Priscilla screamed. She had managed to get back on her feet, one hand gripping the opposite wrist, one side of her hair hanging loose, and her scream shattered the silence like a falling glass. "That girl attacked me," she shouted. 300 people in this room saw it. She attacked me in the middle of this party. She turned toward the crowd, searching for familiar faces, searching for the people who had laughed at her jokes only a week earlier, and she found them, but not one of them looked back at her. "Call the police," she said. "Get her out of here." That was when Judson Hark at table number 7 finally stood up for the first time that night. Judson Hark had remained still for the past 20 minutes, both hands resting on his knees, while a feeling he couldn't name kept rising inside his chest. 10 minutes earlier, when the janitor's sleeve had pulled back and he had seen the hook-shaped scar on the back of her right hand, he had been forced to set down his wine because his hand was trembling. 30 years as a police officer had taught him one thing. There were faces people forgot, but there were wounds they never did. He had told himself he was mistaken. He had been telling himself that for 20 minutes. Then he saw the slap. Then he saw the half-step, and he knew he wasn't mistaken. "No," he said. His voice was rough and not loud, but it cut through the room like a dull blade. She moved out of the way. Every head turned toward him. Judson Hark wasn't a man who enjoyed speaking before a crowd, and everyone in the city knew who he was, knew where he had once stood, knew that when a man like him opened his mouth, it wasn't a joke. He said those 5 words, then sat down again, and he didn't speak for the rest of the evening, but those words closed a door Priscilla would never be able to open again. Rosalind had everything now. She had a witness no court would dare dismiss. She had 24 phones that had recorded the entire scene from beginning to end. She had 300 people who had watched a hand strike her across the face. She had the most powerful man in the city standing in front of her, waiting for her to say one sentence. Only one sentence. All she had to do was tell them about the bucket, the wine-stained napkin, the 3 times she had been made to clean the same spot, the remarks about her cracked hands, and the night would end in the way everyone in that room secretly wanted it to end. Rosalind looked down at the puddle beneath her feet. Then she bent over, picked up the dry cloth that had fallen to the floor, and said, "Please excuse me. I need to get back to work." The entire hall failed to understand what had just happened. The first shock was the sight of someone being humiliated without taking on the appearance of the humiliated. The second was that no one had stopped it, but the third shock was the one that remained lodged in people's minds for months afterward, and it wasn't the half-step. It was the fact that the woman had held everything she needed to destroy the person who had tormented her, and she had laid it all down on the floor beside the cloth. People understood revenge. No one understood restraint. 2 hours later, in the basement, inside the staff changing room where exposed pipes ran across the ceiling and the air smelled of industrial soap, Beatriz Ocampo pressed a cold cloth to Rosalind's cheek and held it there with the calloused hand of a woman who had worked the night shift for 22 years. "Why didn't you let me speak?" she asked. "I was standing right there. I saw everything." "Because you need this job more than I do," Rosalind replied. Bea remained silent for a long time. She lowered the cloth and looked at the young woman sitting before her, as though she were truly seeing her for the first time, the way someone suddenly realized that for the past 2 years they had been walking past a locked door without ever wondering what lay behind it. "Who are you, Rosalind?" she asked. And for the first time that night, the woman looked tired instead of calm. "Just someone trying to pay for her mother's dialysis," she said. That was the truth, but it wasn't the whole truth. Priscilla Castellano Rowe left the Aldermere Hotel through a side entrance, not because she wished to be discreet, but because no one offered to escort her out through the front. In 20 years of living among rooms like that, she had never once been forced to find her own way out. The driver opened the car door, and she settled into the back seat with her clutch resting on her lap. Her knees pressed tightly together, her back straight, holding the posture of a woman who was still being watched, even though no one was watching her anymore. The car pulled away from the parking area. The city lights drifted across the window. She remained perfectly still for 4 blocks, and by the 5th, she realized her right hand was trembling. It wasn't trembling from the cold. It trembled like a muscle that had received the order to strike, but had nothing left to hit. She told the driver to raise the partition. Then she opened her purse, took out her phone, and went to the section of her contacts she hadn't touched in 7 years. There were names people deleted. There were names people kept, not because they still needed them, but because deleting them was also an act, and acts left traces behind. The name she was looking at wasn't a name at all, only 2 capital letters. Years ago, when the Castellano family still had matters no one in the family wished to dirty their hands with, there had been a man who stood in the middle, a man who was never anywhere, and yet always knew where everyone was, and Priscilla had been the one who called him. She had never done anything with her own hands. She had only spoken into a telephone, and afterward, she had read the news like everyone else. She pressed the call button. It rang 4 times. Then someone answered, but there was no greeting, only the sound of a man breathing, and something faint in the background, perhaps a television, perhaps rain. Priscilla said her name. The person on the other end didn't respond. She began to tell the story, and her voice regained its familiar sharpness the moment she heard herself speaking, because retelling a story was how people reclaimed control over it. She told him about the party. She told him about a janitor who had humiliated her before 300 people, and a man who had stood by and refused to defend her. She said she needed to know who that woman was, who she truly was, and she was willing to pay any price. The other end remained silent, so she described her. She described the tall, slender frame, the dark brown hair tied low, the gray eyes that didn't blink. She described the way the woman had shifted half a step, and no one in the room had been quick enough to see it happen. Then she mentioned the hand. She said that when the woman's sleeve pulled back, there was an old scar on the back of her right hand, a hook-shaped scar that Priscilla hadn't been able to drive from her mind during the entire ride home. The other end was silent for 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds lasted longer than anything Priscilla had ever measured. Then came a click. She pulled the phone away from her ear and looked at the screen. The call had ended. She called again. There was no ringing, only the steady voice of an automated recording informing her that the number was no longer in service. She called a second time. The same voice answered. She called a third time, slowly, pressing one number after another, and listened to the entire message until it ended completely. The car stopped beneath the building. The driver opened the door. Priscilla didn't get out. She sat there with the phone in her palm, and she realized something very strange, that in all those 7 years, she had never asked who that man was, never asked what he did with the name she gave him, and never once imagined that the day might come when she would say something that frightened him. That was the detail she couldn't understand. Not that he had ended the call. It was the 3 seconds of silence before he did. She had spent her entire life recognizing the sound of fear in other people's voices, because that was what sustained her. And she knew with absolute certainty that those 3 seconds had been fear. The only difference was that it hadn't come from her side of the call. The driver asked whether she was all right, ma'am. Priscilla looked up and said it was nothing, that she was simply feeling a little cold. She stepped out of the car, crossed the lobby, entered the elevator, and throughout the ascent of 42 floors, she kept rubbing her palms together and couldn't make herself stop. She told herself it was because of the air conditioning in the car. That night, she slept with the lights on, and she didn't ask herself why. At 5 o'clock in the morning, Rosalind Vance climbed 4 flights of stairs in a building in South Lawndale, where the elevator had been broken since before she moved in. She slowed on the 3rd floor, not because she was tired, but because she always stopped there for a few seconds to compose her face before opening the door. It was a habit she had carried for a long time, and she had never told anyone about it. Inside the apartment, everything was old, but nothing was out of place. Odalis Vance lay on the bed beside the window, next to the dialysis machine they were still paying off each month, with an amount equal to exactly 3 of Rosalind's night shifts. She was sleeping, or pretending to sleep, and Rosalind had never been able to tell the difference with her mother. In the corner of the kitchen, a 9-year-old boy stood on a stool with his back turned, his bare feet close together on the seat, completely absorbed in the toaster. "You're home," Teddy said without turning around. I heard the 9th step. The 9th step in that building creaked, and the boy knew exactly what it sounded like, because he had spent 2 years listening for it every morning. He climbed down and turned around, and when he smiled, there was a gap where one of his upper front teeth had been. "I lost my front tooth," he said. "It came out at dinner. I put it in the box, so don't worry." Rosalind set down her bag and sat on the plastic chair beside the table. She was still wearing the gray uniform from her night shift, and she didn't take it off, because taking it off would mean yesterday was over, and she wasn't ready for that yet. Teddy pushed a plate of toast toward her. One corner burned black. "I left it in a little too long," he admitted, "but you can eat the part that isn't burned." Then he ran to his school desk, pulled out a sheet of paper, and held it up before her with both hands as though he were presenting an award. "This week's spelling test," he said. 10 out of 10. The teacher even drew a star in the corner. I was the only one in the class who spelled the hardest word right. Rosalind took the paper, and she truly read it, one line at a time, lingering over it far longer than she needed to, because in the past 24 hours, it was the only thing in the world that had meant anything to her. "Will you read it to me again?" she said. Teddy adjusted the blue hearing aid in his left ear with the practiced movement of a child who had done it thousands of times and no longer thought it was anything important, then stood straight in the middle of the kitchen and read every word aloud in the solemn voice of a little boy who believed he was reading beautifully. On the bed beside the window, Odalis didn't open her eyes, but the corner of her mouth moved slightly. When he finished, Teddy reached into his pocket and took out a copper coin worn so smooth that no image could be seen on it anymore. "I have a math test today," he said. "I'm taking this for luck. Mama Marisol said it brings good luck. Rosalind looked at the coin resting in his small palm. 7 years earlier, the woman who had shared her hospital room had pressed it into Rosalind's hand with only one request, that if she didn't make it, Rosalind would tell the boy his mother loved him very much. The woman hadn't made it, and Rosalind had told the boy those words, and then told them to him again many times over the next 7 years, adding a new detail of her own each time, until the boy had a complete mother living inside his mind. "Keep it in your pocket. Don't carry it in your hand," she said. "You'll drop it if you hold it." Teddy nodded with great seriousness, slipped the coin into his pocket, patted the outside twice to make sure it was there, then put on his shoes and ran to the door. He turned back at the threshold as he did every morning. "Go to sleep, Mom," he said. "Don't clean any more floors." Then he closed the door, and the sound of his feet taking the stairs 2 at a time echoed downward. The apartment fell silent again. Rosalind remained seated for a while, then began clearing the plate from the table. From the bed beside the window, Odalis opened her eyes. "Something happened last night, didn't it?" she said. Rosalind didn't stop moving. She washed the plate, placed it upside down on the rack, and dried both hands on the hem of her shirt. She didn't answer. Her mother watched her daughter from behind, watched that straight back, the back she had been watching for 28 years, and knew exactly how much straighter it became whenever something was wrong. She knew Rosalind wouldn't speak. She also knew that if she asked one more question, Rosalind would walk into the bathroom and turn on the faucet. So she said only one thing, very softly, in the rough voice of someone who hadn't left this room in 4 years. "You lie exactly like your father did," she said, by staying silent. Rosalind stood still beside the sink. Outside the window, the city of Chicago was beginning to brighten, and somewhere else in that city, 3 people had spent the entire night awake because of the same face. One man was watching the same recording again and again. One woman was sleeping with the lights on, and one silver-haired former police officer was sitting in his kitchen with an old notebook in front of him, a notebook he had kept in a drawer for 7 years without opening. By noon the following day, all of Chicago had seen the recording. It appeared on people's phones while they stood in line for coffee, while they waited at red lights, while they ate lunch alone. But the version shared most often, the version replayed millions of times, the version the evening news cut apart and ran behind its reports, always began at the same moment. It began with Priscilla Castellano Rowe falling to the floor. There was no bucket. There was no wine-stained napkin. There were no 3 repeated cleanings of the same already gleaming spot. There was no slap. People watched a woman in an expensive evening gown lying on the ground while a janitor stood over her, and they wrote the rest of the story themselves. Because people always believe the footage they are shown, rather than the footage of what truly happened. In the security room beneath the Aldermere Hotel, Noor Haddad sat before a row of monitors at 11 o'clock that night. She was 23 years old, had worked as a night shift janitor for 14 months, and was in that room only because the security officer on duty had asked her to cover for him for 15 minutes while he went downstairs to smoke. She hadn't intended to watch anything, but the original recording was right there, and her fingers clicked on it before she had time to decide. She dragged the timeline back to before the fall. She watched everything. She watched the bucket fly from Rosalind's hand, watched the napkin fall at her feet, watched the hand strike her face, and she had to stop there for a moment because she found it difficult to breathe. Then she continued. When she reached the second slap, she did something no one else in the hotel had thought to do. She slowed the footage to the lowest speed the system allowed and watched it 1 frame at a time. Priscilla's hand tore through empty air. Her body pitched forward. Her heel slipped. And in the 17th frame, after she lost her balance, there was a movement the naked eye couldn't catch, because it happened in less than 1/5 of a second and was hidden by the sweep of the woman's own rising skirt. Rosalind Vance's right hand reached behind the falling woman's head. It didn't grab. It didn't push. It simply opened and placed itself between that head and the granite floor, long enough to absorb the impact, then withdrew to its former position before anyone had time to see it. Noor rewound the footage. She watched it a second time, then a third. By the 4th, her hand was shaking so badly that the cursor slipped away from the timeline. 300 people in the hall that night believed they had just witnessed a janitor bring down the woman who had tormented her. The entire city of Chicago believed the same thing now. But the truth existed in the 17th frame, and the truth was that this woman, in 1/5 of a second, in the middle of the greatest humiliation of her life, had reached out to keep the person who had just slapped her from striking her head against stone. Noor sat motionless for a long time before the frozen image. She thought about sending the footage to someone. Then she thought about the paper in the drawer of her rented room, the paper stating that her legal residency was tied to her employment contract at this very hotel, and that the contract would be reviewed the following month. She thought about her mother in Beirut, who still called every Sunday, and still asked whether she was all right. She thought about the woman in the evening gown lying on the floor, the older stepsister of Emmett Castellano, the man who owned the building. Then she reached out and turned off the monitor. She stood, pushed the chair back into its exact place, and when the security officer returned, she said only that nothing had happened. She didn't sleep that night. She didn't sleep the night after that either. Some secrets rested inside a person like a pebble. Other secrets didn't rest at all. They began to eat away from within, a little more each day, until the person carrying them had to choose between losing the life they had built or losing who they were. Noor Haddad had begun counting down from that night, and she didn't know it yet. Priscilla Castellano-Rowe wasn't accustomed to waiting, so she hired 3 private investigation firms at the same time and told none of them about the other 2. She wanted 3 independent answers, because she believed that if 3 people dug the same hole, they would reach the bottom faster. Her request was simple, contained on a single sheet of paper. Debts, criminal records, men, the child's father, anything that could turn a sympathetic story into a scandal, because she had lived in this world long enough to know that people didn't need the truth. They only needed a reason to stop feeling sorry for someone. 4 days later, all 3 firms called, and all 3 said almost the same thing. The woman named Rosalind Vance had complete tax records for the past 2 years. Before that was a 7-year gap in which no agency in the state had preserved a single line about her. No taxes, no insurance, no lease, no renewed driver's license. The oldest address they could trace led to a building on the west side that had been demolished 3 years earlier to make room for a parking lot, and the building's resident records had gone down with it into the rubble. Her medical records were sealed. Not sealed in the ordinary way, with a hospital refusing to release them, but sealed in the way that made a system return a message, instructing the user to contact the legal department whenever someone entered her identification number, while the legal department never answered the phone. One of the 3 investigators told her that in 20 years of work, he had encountered records like these only 3 times, and all 3 had involved cases whose names he didn't wish to repeat. Priscilla listened to everything. Then she told them to keep digging. The 3rd firm was the one that found it. They didn't search government records. They searched the photographic archive of a local newspaper that had closed years ago, an archive the owner's heir had sold off for almost nothing to a used bookstore. And there, among damp cardboard boxes, they found a printed photograph with one corner burned away. The photograph had been taken in 2019 in Gary, Indiana. In the frame was a warehouse pouring smoke and an iron doorway torn from its hinges. There were 2 people in the photograph. A man was being carried out, his head hanging forward, his feet barely touching the ground, and a young woman was supporting him with her left shoulder, her entire body leaning to one side beneath his weight. Smoke and hair concealed most of her face, making her impossible to identify. But her right arm was raised high, her open hand braced against the doorframe to keep it from collapsing, and that hand rested at the center of the brightest part of the photograph. On the back of that hand was a scar, a curved scar with a hook at one end, so clear that someone could have redrawn it from memory. The caption printed beneath the image contained only one sentence: unidentified witness, presumed dead. The investigator brought the photograph to her in person instead of sending it by email, and that was the first detail that struck Priscilla as unusual, because he had never done that at any other point in the investigation. He placed the photograph on the glass table, pushed it toward her, then stepped back and remained standing. "Mrs. Rowe," he said, "I advise you to stop." Priscilla didn't answer. She was staring at the photograph. He continued, his voice even, as though he were reading a report he had been composing in his head throughout the drive. He said he had researched the fire and found no public investigative record. He said 3 newspapers had covered the story during the first week, then all 3 stopped reporting on it on the same day. He said the name of the man in the photograph couldn't be found anywhere either. Then he gave her his final warning, and he spoke very slowly. Some gaps in a record exist because people are careless. Some exist because people are busy. But some gaps are created by a very patient hand. And when you encounter the 3rd kind, what you should do is step back, not move closer, because that hand is still somewhere out there, and it hasn't let go. He left the photograph behind and walked away. Priscilla sat alone in the room, 42 floors above the ground. She stared at the scorched photograph for a long time. All her life, there had always been a voice inside her head, a voice commenting on everything, judging everyone, dividing the world into things of value and things without any, and that voice had never been silent, not even while she slept. Now it was silent. She reached out and touched the place where the scar appeared in the photograph, then pulled her hand back as though she had touched something hot. She didn't understand why she had done it. She didn't understand why, tonight, just as on the night before, both of her palms felt ice cold. And what she didn't know at all, what would have made her throw that photograph down 42 floors at once had she known it, was that 7 years earlier, she had heard about the woman in the photograph exactly once, over the phone, in a brief report stating that no one had survived that night. On the 40th floor of another building, 3 blocks from the Aldermere Hotel, Emmett Castellano was watching the recording for the 11th time. He didn't fast forward. He didn't skip a single moment. He let it run from the beginning, from the moment the woman in the gray uniform pushed her supply cart into the grand hall at 7 o'clock in the evening, until she disappeared from the final frame at 2 o'clock in the morning, and each time the bucket was knocked from her hand, he remained perfectly still, without moving, without so much as a shift in his shoulders. Fitzbarlow stood behind him through all 4 of those hours. He asked no questions. He had worked for this man for 11 years, and he knew that when Emmett Castellano watched something that many times, it wasn't because he had failed to understand it. It was because he was trying to endure it. On the 11th viewing, when the screen went dark, Fitz finally spoke. "You know her," he said. It wasn't a question. Emmett didn't turn around. He reached across with his right hand, pinched the fingertip of the black leather glove on his left, and pulled it off. The glove fell soundlessly onto the glass table. Fitz had seen that hand a few times over the past 11 years, but never from this close, and never beneath light this bright. Emmett Castellano's left hand was missing 2 fingers. The remaining skin had been stretched tight and folded into unnatural lines, the kind of wound carried by someone who had survived something no one should have survived. He placed the hand on the table, palm upward, uncovered, and looked at it like a man rereading an old letter. "I've been looking for her for 7 years, he said. Fitz said nothing. 7 years with the wrong name, Emmett continued. No one had time to ask her name that night. The only person who heard it wrong. And I paid 30 people over 7 years to search for a woman who didn't exist. I searched in 4 states. I searched hospital records, nursing assistant registries, payroll records from every place she might have worked. Once, I flew to Cleveland because someone claimed they had seen her, and the person turned out to be a 45-year-old woman with similar hair." Fitz looked down at the hand resting on the glass. Then he asked the question he had been holding in his mind for 4 hours. "She worked in your hotel for 2 years, he said. 2 years, sir." Emmett nodded once, very slowly, and that was the part he still couldn't forgive himself for. He didn't live at the Aldermere. He had a room on the top floor that he used no more than 6 nights a year, usually for major events, and the rest of his life took place in this building, in windowless conference rooms, in cars moving between 2 addresses. Rosalind Vance worked the night shift. She arrived at 7 o'clock in the evening and left at 5 o'clock in the morning, and during those 2 years, she cleaned the hallways he crossed only in daylight, pushed her cart through rooms he had left hours before. They had never once stood in the same room. Not once. He had walked across floors she had cleaned every morning, and he hadn't known. 2 years, he said. She was under my roof for 2 years, and it took me 90 seconds. Fitz looked up. 90 seconds, Emmett repeated. That was the length of time between the moment he stepped onto the mezzanine railing and looked down into the grand hall, and the moment the bucket flew from her hand. He had seen a janitor being humiliated, and he had intended to turn away, because in his world, there were too many scenes like that, and he couldn't intervene in all of them. Then the woman bent down to pick up the napkin, and he saw the way she placed one hand against the floor to steady herself, the way that hand opened and closed again. He had seen that hand once before in his life, 7 years earlier, through smoke, holding up a doorway so he could crawl through. 90 seconds, and he had still remained where he was. "Then why didn't you go down?" Fitz asked. "You were standing right there. You only had to walk down 10 steps. Emmett turned his chair and looked directly at the man who had followed him for 11 years. "What do you think would have happened if I had?" he said. If I had walked through 300 people and the cameras of 4 newspapers and helped a janitor to her feet in front of all of them. Fitz didn't answer. By the next morning, the entire city would have been asking who she was, Emmett said. And among the people asking that question would have been a few who weren't asking out of curiosity. The day I publicly protect someone, every enemy I have knows that person matters to me. And in this world, the fastest way to kill a man like me isn't to shoot me. It's to find the one thing I couldn't bear to lose. He picked up the glove and began pulling it back over his left hand. One finger at a time, slowly. I spent 7 years looking for her so I could say thank you, he said. And last night, I finally understood that the most dangerous thing I could give that woman was my attention. Fitz watched as the glove was drawn over his wrist. Then what are you going to do now? He asked. Emmett rose and walked toward the window, where the city of Chicago stretched beneath him in the gray light of an afternoon gathering rain. I'm going to do what I should have done from the beginning, he said. Get her out of that building before someone else recognizes that hand. And he didn't know that at that very moment, in a room not far away, a platinum blonde woman was sitting before a scorched photograph, staring at that same hand. At 2 o'clock in the morning, in the basement of the Aldermere Hotel, along a service corridor where pipes ran across the ceiling and the sound of industrial washing machines echoed from the far end, Rosalind Vance was kneeling on one knee beside the wheelchair of the old storeroom attendant, tightening a screw on the front wheel with a pair of pliers borrowed from the electrician, while the old man sat above her drinking coffee and telling a story she had already heard 3 times. She listened for the 4th time, as though it were the first. Then, footsteps sounded at the entrance to the corridor, and the old man stopped in the middle of a sentence, set his coffee cup on his lap, and wheeled himself toward the storeroom door without another word. Rosalind didn't turn around. She tightened the final screw, spun the wheel once to test it, then placed the pliers on the concrete floor. You shouldn't be down here, she said. This is my hotel, Emmett Castellano replied. She stood, brushed her palms together, and this time she turned to look at him. Beneath the pale white fluorescent lights, there was no gilded vaulted ceiling, no crowd of 300 people, no cameras, and the man looked much smaller than he had the night before. But this isn't where men like you usually tell the truth, she said. He didn't react. He stood 3 steps away, his arms resting at his sides, and allowed the words to remain between them for a long moment, like a man who understood that denying them would only make them truer. You're right, he said. That's why I came down here to say it once. He gave her a name. It was the name of a city on the West Coast, more than 3,000 kilometers from Chicago, and he spoke it with the calmness of a man reading out an address. He said that a house there had already been purchased in the name of a company with no connection to him, along with enough money to ensure that a woman would never have to hold a floor mop again. He said there was a good hospital 15 minutes from the house by car, and that her mother's entire treatment record could be transferred there within 4 days. He said there was a good public school in the neighborhood with a dedicated support program for children with hearing loss, and he spoke that detail more slowly than the others. She let him finish. Then she asked, What do you know about my son? I know he wears a hearing aid in his left ear, he said. I know he's 9 years old. I don't know anything more than that, and I didn't allow anyone to investigate further. Rosalind nodded once. When do you want me to leave? She asked. As soon as possible. This week. She bent down, picked up the pliers, wiped them against the hem of her uniform, and placed them on her supply cart. No, she said. He didn't ask why. He simply waited, and that was the only thing he did that night that made her look at him a little longer. This morning, 3 people in my building asked whether I was all right, she said. The woman who owns the grocery store downstairs wouldn't take money for 2 cans of milk. A 17-year-old girl who works the morning shift at the diner across the street ran after me all the way to the end of the block just to tell me she had seen the recording. She didn't say anything else. She only wanted me to know that she had seen it. She paused. If I disappear next week, she continued, every one of those people will understand what happened in exactly the same way. They'll understand that a rich person became angry, and the person they were angry with had to leave the city. And the next time someone is treated that way, they won't stand up, because they'll have learned that the anger of the wealthy is a form of power. I don't want to teach them that. Emmett remained silent. You want to protect me, she said. I understand that, but the way you've chosen to protect me is exactly what she wants, except that you're willing to pay, and she isn't. Both choices end with me disappearing from that room. There is danger, he said. Do you understand what you're refusing? I understand more clearly than you think, she replied. The words fell between them, and they sounded unlike anything else she had said before. Emmett stepped forward half a pace. You remember me, he said, so softly that the washing machines at the end of the corridor nearly swallowed the words. Rosalind was bending over her supply cart, arranging the cleaning cloths again. She didn't look up. I remember enough, she said. Those 3 words. He stood there and heard them. And in his mind, they meant that she remembered that night, remembered the doorway, remembered the hand that had clung to her shoulder, and had chosen not to speak of it because she didn't want him to carry the debt. He heard those 3 words as forgiveness. For 7 years, he had searched for someone so he could say thank you, and tonight that person stood 3 steps away and told him that she didn't need to hear it. Something inside him became lighter, something he had carried for so long that he had forgotten how heavy it was. He had no idea there was another way to understand her words. He didn't know that the woman bending over the cart remembered far more than that she remembered even the things he didn't know he had left behind, and that those 3 words weren't forgiveness but an incomplete confession. He would understand one day, but it would take time. Before leaving, he said, if anything changes, come to me before you go to anyone else. Rosalind pushed the supply cart toward the freight elevator. That depends, she said, on whether the change means danger or merely being seen. The elevator doors closed. Emmett Castellano stood alone in the basement corridor beneath the fluorescent lights, and he didn't realize that throughout the entire conversation, the woman had never once asked his name. Every Sunday, Rosalind Vance went to the women's shelter on Kedzie Street, and she had been doing it for 2 years without ever accepting a single dollar. She arrived at 10 o'clock in the morning, spread an old exercise mat across the center of the common room, and the women there sat in a circle around her. She didn't teach them how to fight. She had never taught anyone how to fight in her life. She taught them where to place their feet, how to lower their center of gravity, how to turn their hips halfway when someone grabbed their wrist, and she gave all of those things the same name, keeping your balance. She told them that people didn't fall because they were pushed too hard. They fell because they were standing the wrong way. And once they learned to stand correctly, most of the people trying to shove them would grow tired first. That morning, 14 women sat in the circle. Rosalind was showing a middle-aged woman how to free her wrist from someone's grip, and she had slowed the movement down for the 3rd time when someone at the far end of the room stood up. The woman was young. She had arrived at the shelter only 2 weeks earlier, and she was holding a phone in her hand. She didn't say anything. She only looked at Rosalind, then down at the screen, then back at Rosalind, and she took 1 step backward until her shoulders touched the wall. That's you, she said. You're the woman in that video. The entire room turned. Several women took out their phones, and for the next 30 seconds, all 14 of them watched the same recording the entire city of Chicago had seen. The recording that began at the exact moment a woman in an evening gown fell onto the granite floor. There was no bucket in it. There was no slap. There was nothing at all except a woman lying on the ground and a janitor standing over her. Another woman rose, then another. They didn't say anything, and that was the hardest part to endure. They simply moved their chairs half a meter away, and that half meter was enough to divide the room in 2. 7 women remained seated on Rosalind's side, including an elderly woman who had lived at the shelter for 4 years and had learned how to keep her balance from those very hands. The elderly woman looked around and opened her mouth to speak, but Rosalind gave a small shake of her head. She didn't explain. She could have said the recording had been cut. She could have told them about the wine-stained napkin, about cleaning the same spot 3 times, about the hand that had struck her face in front of 300 people. She could even have told them the one thing she herself didn't know anyone had seen, that in 1/5 of a second, she had reached out to keep the other woman's head from striking the stone. She said none of it. She knelt, rolled up the exercise mat, tied it, and stood it in the corner where it had rested for the past 2 years. Then she rose and thanked everyone for that morning. She thanked even the women standing against the wall. She walked to the door, and no one stopped her. It was cold outside. Rosalind stood on the front steps for a moment with both hands in her coat pockets, and she thought about something she had learned a very long time ago, that people weren't afraid of evil. They were used to evil. What made them step away was the thing they couldn't name. When a poor woman was struck, they felt sorry for her. When a poor woman was struck and didn't fall, they began to wonder who she was. And in the past 7 years, that question had never brought her anything good. She pulled up the collar of her coat and walked toward the bus stop. 3 days later, the scorched photograph would be lying on another woman's table, and the entire city would begin asking that same question. On Tuesday afternoon, Rosalind Vance took 3 buses to reach the outpatient treatment center on the north side, and she waited for 40 minutes in the corridor before she was allowed inside. Dr. Ansel Whitfield sat on a vinyl-covered chair beside the window, an intravenous line inserted into the back of his hand. He was 71 years old, and he had lost nearly 22 pounds since the last time she had seen him. He didn't turn his head when she entered. He didn't greet her either. "You let them see your hand," he said. "I know," she replied. He kept looking out the window. Who recognized it? Rosalind pulled a plastic chair closer and sat down. She didn't answer. The old man nodded slowly, and that nod was his way of acknowledging that her silence had answered more fully than any name could have. He raised the hand without the intravenous line and adjusted the thick glasses on the bridge of his nose. His hand trembled, not from emotion, but because that was what had been happening to him for the past 2 years. "I always knew this day would come," he said. "I only hoped it would come after I was dead." He began to tell her, and she didn't interrupt, because she knew he had never told this story to anyone and might not have many opportunities left. 7 years earlier, on that night, he had been the doctor on the overnight shift in the emergency room of a small hospital, 20 minutes from Gary. He had practiced medicine for 30 years and believed there was nothing left in the world that could surprise him. Then, shortly before 3 o'clock in the morning, a car without license plates stopped at the entrance, and a silver-haired man with a close-cropped cut carried in a 21-year-old woman whom Ansel was certain wouldn't survive the night. He said he worked on her for 4 hours, and when morning came, she was still breathing. Then he told her the rest. At 7 o'clock that morning, 2 men in plain clothes came to the reception desk, asking about anyone who had been brought in from the direction of Gary. They wore no uniforms, showed no identification, and displayed no concern for anyone at all. He had stood behind the curtain and listened to the entire exchange, and within 40 seconds, he understood exactly what was happening and exactly what would happen to the woman in the room behind him if he answered honestly. "I signed a document," he said. "I wrote down the time of death, the cause, and I signed my name at the bottom. I lied beneath the professional oath I had kept for 30 years without a single stain." He turned his head and looked at her for the first time since she entered. "And I slept more peacefully that night than I had on any other night in those 30 years, he said. Rosalind sat motionless. She had known this, but knowing something and hearing it told by the person who had done it were 2 different things, and she felt something tighten inside her chest. "Don't tell anyone," she said. "Who do you think I would tell?" he replied. Then he fell silent for a while, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed. It was no longer the voice of an old man recounting a distant memory. It was the voice of a doctor delivering test results. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "Do you know what they'll find if someone starts reopening the records from that night?" Rosalind didn't answer. "They won't discover that you're alive," he said. "That's what you're afraid of. But that isn't what will happen. That document states very clearly that someone died. People don't go looking for the dead. They'll go looking for the signature at the bottom of the page." He raised his trembling hand. "They'll find me," he said. "And once they find me, they'll have a name, a hospital, a specific night, and from there, all they'll have to do is pull the thread." Dr. Ansel Whitfield, 71 years old, undergoing chemotherapy, the man who falsified a death. "How long do you think I'll hold out against a skilled lawyer?" "You won't have to hold anything back," Rosalind said. He cut her off, and it was the only time that entire afternoon when he raised his voice. "I'm not afraid for myself," he said. "I'm 71 years old, and every Tuesday I sit here for 4 hours in exchange for a few more months. I'm afraid for you, because the moment they prove that the woman in those records didn't die, everything you've built over the past 7 years will be dragged into the light at once. The name, the child, the mother lying beside the dialysis machine, everything." Rosalind looked down at her hands resting on her knees. She looked at the curved scar on the back of her right hand, the scar she had hidden for 7 years beneath long sleeves, beneath rubber gloves, by always standing with half her body turned away whenever she spoke to someone. Then she raised her head. "Then I'll let them find me first," she said. The old man looked at her for a very long time. "Do you understand what you just said?" he asked. "I do," she replied. "If they find you first, then you're the man who lied. If they find me first, then I'm the woman who survived. And a living person can stand up and speak, A document can't. The intravenous line released one slow drop after another into the silence. Beyond the window, the city of Chicago was turning the leaden gray of a late autumn afternoon. Dr. Ansel Whitfield closed his eyes and said nothing more. But when Rosalind rose to leave, he reached out, took hold of her wrist, and kept it there longer than necessary, the way someone held on to the life they had risked an entire career to save and now had to watch walk out the door. It took Fitzbarlow 4 days to uncover what had happened, and he began with a very small question that no one at the hotel had considered worth asking. Why had the complete recordings disappeared? Not just one recording. All of them. The footage from 6 camera angles inside the Aldermere Grand Hall that night, the recordings that showed the bucket, the wine-stained napkin, the hand striking the janitor across the face in front of 300 people, had all been erased from the storage system during the same night. And it hadn't happened only at the hotel. The videos recorded on the guests' phones had also begun disappearing from online platforms one after another. Not because they had been removed under an official order, but through a slower and far more expensive method. Someone had tracked down each account owner individually and offered to buy the footage from them. Fitz followed the money. It passed through a media consulting company with only one employee, then through a trust account opened at a small suburban bank, and then the trail stopped. By the 4th day, Fitz had obtained the name of the original account holder, and he carried it to the 40th floor at 10 o'clock that night. Emmett Castellano was standing beside the window when he entered. It was her, wasn't it? Emmett said without turning around. He had been thinking about it for 4 days, and had reached the only conclusion he considered reasonable. Priscilla had bought every recording in order to erase the images of herself tormenting a janitor, leaving behind only the portion that made the entire city believe she was the victim. It was a clever move, a cruel one, and entirely like her. "No, sir," Fitz said. He placed the sheet of paper on the glass table. Emmett turned, picked it up, and read the name on the first line. Then he read it again. Then a 3rd time. Odalis Vance. He sat down. In 11 years of working for this man, Fitz had never seen him sit down that way. "She doesn't have an account at that bank," Emmett said. "She doesn't have anything." Fitz handed him the 2nd sheet. He had managed to trace it because money of that size always left a trail, and the trail led to 2 places. The first was a pawnshop on Cermak Road, where 4 days earlier, a middle-aged woman had arrived in a privately hired ambulance paid by the hour, seated in a wheelchair, and sold a gold wedding ring whose plating had nearly worn away. The owner remembered her, Fitz said. She didn't bargain over the price once. The second place had cost far more. 31 years earlier, when Odalis Vance was still healthy and still working the morning shift at a garment factory, she had purchased a life insurance policy and paid into it faithfully every month for more than 30 years, even during the hardest years, even during the years when she had to choose between making the insurance payment and buying enough food to last the entire month. It was the only thing she had managed to keep after illness took everything else from her. It was the only thing she could still leave to her daughter after she was gone. And 4 days earlier, she had called the insurance company and requested the full surrender value of that policy, ending it, canceling it, turning 31 years of payments into a single cash sum deposited into a trust account opened in her name. Emmett lowered the paper. "She hasn't left that room in 4 years, he said. Fitz nodded. "She left it once, sir. Only once." Inside the room on the 40th floor, there was nothing but the sound of the air conditioning. Emmett Castellano sat motionless for a long time, and Fitz waited because he knew the man was calculating something and didn't want to interrupt him. But Emmett wasn't calculating anything. He was thinking about something very simple that had never occurred to him during 7 years of searching for a woman. That woman had a mother too, and that mother, confined to bed beside a dialysis machine they were still paying off in a 4th-floor apartment without an elevator, had watched her daughter being humiliated on a phone screen, and she couldn't stand up, couldn't go there, couldn't do any of the things a mother would have wanted to do. So she had done the only thing still within her power. She sold her wedding ring. She burned through 31 years of savings. She bought back every recording, one by one, so her daughter wouldn't have to live in a city where anyone could open a phone and replay that moment whenever they wished. "Have you told Miss Vance?" Fitz asked. "No," Emmett replied. "Does she know?" Emmett looked down at the paper on the glass table. He thought of the woman standing in the basement corridor that night. The woman who had refused a house on the West Coast and a good hospital 15 minutes away by car, The woman who had said she didn't want to teach her neighborhood that the anger of the wealthy was a form of power. "No," he said. "She doesn't know. If she knew, she would never have allowed it to happen." He rose and walked toward the window. Below him, the city of Chicago glowed through the night. Millions of windows, millions of lives. And behind one of those windows, a woman lay beside a machine that sounded with a steady rhythm, holding a secret she would never reveal. "Some people protect one another with power," he said, "and some protect one another with the last thing they have left." But what neither Emmett Castellano nor Fitz Barlow understood, and wouldn't understand until everything finally came apart, was why a bedridden mother had paid such a terrible price merely to recover a recording, because the true reason wasn't in the images captured on that recording. It was in the sound. Rosalind Vance learned the truth on Thursday afternoon, and she learned it in the worst possible way, from a stranger. An employee from the insurance company called the telephone number, listed in the records, to confirm that the policy termination had been completed, and to ask whether Mrs. O'Daly Vance wished to receive a copy by mail. Rosalind stood in the middle of a hospital corridor, with the phone pressed to her ear, and listened as the employee read out the policy number, the date it had been opened, 31 years of contributions, and the final amount. She thanked them. She ended the call. Then she walked to the bus stop, and throughout the 40-minute ride, she couldn't form a single complete thought. She reached the 4th-floor apartment shortly before 7 o'clock that evening. Teddy was at his afternoon tutoring class and wouldn't be home until after 8. She knew that, and she had calculated the timing precisely. Odalis lay on her side in bed, facing the window. She was awake. She had been awake for a long time, and perhaps she had been waiting ever since the telephone rang across the city. "You sold Dad's ring," Rosalind said. Odalis didn't answer. "You canceled the insurance policy. 31 years. You got into your wheelchair, hired an ambulance by the hour, went to a pawn shop on Cermak Road, and didn't bargain once." Her mother kept looking out the window. Rosalind stood in the center of the room with her arms hanging straight at her sides, and she could hear her own voice breaking in places she couldn't control. "That was the only thing you had left to leave me," she said. "Do you understand that? You paid into it through all those years, when we ate rice with salt. I remember those years. I remember them better than you think, and you traded all of them for a few phone recordings just so people wouldn't watch me being slapped anymore." Odalis turned her head. She didn't deny it. She didn't apologize either. That frightened Rosalind more than anything else, because in 28 years as this woman's daughter, she had learned that her mother fell silent in that particular way, only when she had spent a very long time calculating something and had already accepted the full cost of it. "I didn't buy them for your dignity," O'Daly said. Rosalind stood still. "Do you think I've spent 4 years lying here without knowing anything?" she said. "Do you think I care about that ring? I wore it for 31 years, and your father has been gone for 11. That ring was only gold." Then she spoke the next sentence, and she spoke it very slowly. "I bought them because of the laugh." Rosalind didn't understand. "In the first recording you sent me," Odalis said, "the one you told me not to watch, at the 11th second, that woman laughs. Not loudly, just once, very briefly, when the bucket falls. The room was so quiet that the dialysis machine could be heard. 7 years ago," Odalis said, "when you were lying in that hospital and I sat beside your bed for 4 months, you told me about that night. Not much. You never tell much. But there was one detail you repeated again and again. You mentioned it every time, and I never understood why you held on to that one detail. You said the person who ordered that door locked wasn't there. You said there was a telephone sitting on a wooden crate with the speaker turned on, and the order came through that phone. You said it was a woman's voice." Rosalind reached behind her for the back of the chair and sat down. "You described that voice to me hundreds of times," Odalis said. "You described how it dropped lower at the end of a sentence. You described the way it paused for one beat before finishing, as though the speaker were smiling in the middle of it. You described it so many times that I heard it in my sleep. 7 years, sweetheart." She paused, and when she continued, her voice was rougher. "Then one morning, I opened my phone, and I heard it laugh." Rosalind sat motionless. Inside her mind, something enormous and carefully constructed was collapsing, one level at a time, without a sound. 2 years. For 2 years, she had applied to the same hotel 11 times before they hired her. For 2 years, she had chosen the night shift. chosen her work area, chosen every detail with a patience she had believed was wisdom. For 2 years, she had cleaned floors beneath one man's roof, passed the door to his office every night, counted every footstep, and told herself she was getting very close. For 2 years, she had searched for a name, and that name had stood 1 meter away from her in the grand hall, had slapped her across the face before 300 people, and she hadn't recognized it. "Tell me," she said, and there was almost no sound in her voice. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you would have gone looking for her that very night," Odalis replied. "And I needed you to still be home the next morning." From the corridor came the creak of the 9th stair, followed by the sound of a 9-year-old boy taking the steps 2 at a time. Odalis reached out, took hold of her daughter's wrist, squeezed it once very quickly, then let go. "Wash your face," she said. "The boy is home." Fitzbarlow didn't uncover it because he was suspicious. He uncovered it because he was doing his job, reviewing the complete personnel files of everyone who had been present in the grand hall that night, and when he opened Rosalind Vance's file, he found something that made him stop and read more slowly. She had applied to the Aldermere Hotel 11 times. The first application had been submitted 26 months earlier. Rejected. 3 weeks later, she applied again. Rejected. 4 weeks after that, she applied once more. And so it continued. 11 applications in less than a year, for the same position at the same hotel, while hundreds of other places across Chicago were short-staffed and offering the same pay. He turned the page. On the 8th application, the hiring manager had written a note stating that the applicant had requested the night shift and declined the morning position she had been offered. On the 10th, she had specified the area where she wished to work, not the guest room floors, where tips were 3 times higher, not the kitchen, where the shifts were shorter. She had asked to be assigned to the administrative section on the 2nd floor, and the 2nd floor was where the financial records for the entire Castellano organization had been stored before everything was digitized 3 years earlier. Fitz closed the file and went straight to the 40th floor. That night, shortly before 2 o'clock in the morning, Emmett Castellano stood waiting in the basement service corridor, in the exact place where the elderly storeroom attendant usually sat drinking his coffee. Rosalind pushed her supply cart out of the freight elevator and saw him. She didn't appear surprised. She stopped the cart, removed her rubber gloves, folded them in half, and placed them on the edge of the cart, and the way she performed those small movements told him that she had been preparing for this moment for a very long time. 11 times, he said. 11, she replied. He held out the file. She didn't look at it. "Ask me directly whatever you want to ask," she said. "I don't have the strength to go in circles tonight." Emmett lowered the file. "Why did you come here?" And she told him. She spoke in an even voice, neither loud nor soft, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this story inside her mind for 2 years and was now simply reading it aloud. She said that on the night in Gary, while she lay on the ground beside the torn doorway, a telephone had fallen onto the concrete floor about an arm's length away, and its screen was still lit. She said she had seen the string of numbers on that screen for approximately 3 seconds before someone kicked the phone away. 3 seconds, and she had carried those numbers in her memory for 7 years, reciting them silently every night before sleep the way some people recited prayers, because they were the only thing she had managed to carry out of that night. She said it had taken her 5 years to find someone who knew how to read a sequence like that. He was a retired accountant living in Rockford, a man who had once worked for 3 banks and had lost his professional license for reasons she hadn't asked about. He studied the numbers for 10 minutes, then told her they weren't a telephone number. They were the reference code for a payment order, and it took him another 14 months to trace that order to a charitable foundation registered in the state of Illinois. A foundation with a name and an address, and that name was Castellano. Rosalind looked directly into his face as she spoke the final part. "I didn't come here to hide," she said. "I came here to find evidence against you." The basement corridor went silent. The industrial washing machines continued turning steadily at the far end. 2 years, she continued. "Every night, I walked past the door to your office on the 2nd floor. I stood outside that records room 109 times. I know exactly when the guard leaves for his late meal. I know what kind of lock is on that door. I never opened it, because I was waiting until I had enough in my hands that, when I finally did, I would only need to open it once." Emmett said nothing. "You asked whether I remembered you," she said. "You thought my answer was forgiveness. You walked away from this corridor that night feeling lighter. I saw it in your back when you turned away. But I remember enough, sir. I remember enough to stand 3 meters away from you every night for 2 years and still keep my hands steady." A long silence followed. People often imagined that when a man like Emmett Castellano heard something like that, he would become angry, or laugh, or do one of the things men in his world were expected to do. He did none of them. He stood there, and there was no expression on his face that Rosalind could name, and only much later would she understand that what she had seen that night wasn't calm. It was the feeling of a man realizing that the person he owed more than anyone in his life had spent 2 years believing he was the one who had sent her to die, and had still returned to work every night. Then he asked, very softly, "And have you found it now?" Rosalind picked up the rubber gloves from the edge of the cart. "Yes," she said, "but it doesn't bear your name." She pulled the gloves on, one hand at a time. 4 days ago, I still believed it was you," she said. "I came to work for 2 years with that thought inside my head. And the night you came down here and offered to buy me a house, I stood in this exact place believing you were paying me to disappear before I found the truth." Emmett asked who had told her. "My mother," she replied. "She has been confined to bed for 4 years, and she recognized the person in 30 seconds, from nothing more than a laugh in a recording I told her not to watch, and I cleaned your floors for 2 years." She pushed the supply cart forward 2 steps, then stopped without turning around. "Do you want to know why I didn't leave this city when you offered?" she said. "Now you know." And Emmett Castellano remained alone in that corridor for the second time, beneath the same pale fluorescent lights, with a name beginning to form inside his mind that he still didn't dare speak aloud. Rain fell over Chicago throughout that entire afternoon, and by evening it still hadn't let up, tapping against the tall windows of the Aldermere Grand Hall with a steady rhythm that many people would later say they remembered more clearly than any words spoken that night. The Employee Appreciation Dinner was an annual tradition, an evening when the people who usually served the tables were allowed to sit at them. And that year, 4 newspapers had been invited for reasons no one on the organizing committee could explain clearly. Rosalind Vance was still wearing her gray uniform. She had been assigned a seat at the same table as Beatriz Ocampo and the rest of the night shift, but she didn't sit down. She stood in the aisle beside them, because after 22 months of working in that room, her body no longer knew how to remain still inside it. It was only because she was standing in the aisle that the elderly woman was able to stop her. Corinne Delacroix Ashby was 74 years old, and she had spent 20 minutes at table number 7, with her hands folded together, staring at the young woman in the gray uniform without daring to blink. Then she rose, braced one hand against the edge of the table, and stepped into the aisle with the slow movements of someone who hadn't hurried in a very long time. She took Rosalind's wrist in both hands. "You," she said. Rosalind tried to pull her hand away. The elderly woman tightened her grip, and her hands trembled so badly that Rosalind's entire arm began trembling with them. "They told me you were dead," Corinne said. The whole stretch of aisle fell silent. "For 7 years, I have placed flowers on 2 graves. One belongs to my son. The other has no name. They only told me that a young woman tried to pull him out and couldn't make it in time, and that she died too. For 7 years, I have brought flowers to someone whose face I had never seen." The elderly woman raised her eyes to the face of the young woman standing before her. "I placed flowers there again this morning," she said, 10 hours ago. Rosalind couldn't speak. In 7 years, she had learned how to endure almost anything. She had never learned how to endure this. And from the other end of the room, Priscilla Castellano Rowe saw the entire scene. She saw a wealthy elderly woman holding the hand of a janitor and weeping. She saw the whole room turn to look, and inside her mind, every piece fell into exactly the place where she wanted it to fall, because people always saw what they had already decided to see. She stood and tapped the handle of a knife against the rim of her glass. The crystal rang 3 times, and the room went still. "Before this evening continues," Priscilla said, "I believe everyone sitting here deserves to know who they are sharing this room with." She opened the file directly on the table. She spoke of 7 years without a single entry in any state system. She spoke of an address that led to a building that had been demolished. She spoke of sealed medical records that none of her lawyers had been able to open. Then she held up a yellowed sheet of paper and said it was a copy of a death certificate bearing the name Rosalind Vance, signed on March 19th, 2019. The room shifted, and finally, she placed the scorched photograph on the table, turned it toward the crowd, and said that the woman in the picture had raised her right hand, and on the back of that hand was a hook-shaped scar, and anyone who wished to verify it needed only to take 3 steps toward the employee standing in the aisle. This woman declared herself dead, Priscilla said. Then she changed her life, changed her identity, and applied for work at my family's hotel. I don't know why she came here, but I do know that no honest person needs 7 years of not existing. The doors to the grand hall opened, and 4 uniformed police officers entered with the cold air and the smell of rain. They didn't rush forward. They only stood at the back of the room, and that was enough. What happened next was something Rosalind had expected for a very long time, and still hadn't managed to prepare for. The people who had worked beside her for 22 months began to move away. No one ran, no one pointed. They simply stepped back half a pace, one person after another. That very small half-step people took when they were no longer certain. And within 10 seconds, an empty circle had formed around her. Bea Ocampo rose from her chair, but the veteran worker could do no more than stand there with both hands gripping the back of the chair, unable to decide what to do next. Rosalind didn't say a word. She didn't object. She didn't raise her hand to prove anything. She didn't turn toward the speaking platform to look for Emmett Castellano. She simply stood inside that empty space, with her arms resting at her sides, and allowed the room to decide who she was without needing her. Then a voice rose from behind the crowd. I have something everyone needs to see. 300 heads turned. Noor Haddad, 23 years old, stepped out from the line of employees standing along the rear wall, and she was holding a phone in both hands because one hand alone couldn't keep it steady. Her face was pale. Her voice trembled so badly that she had to repeat the first sentence twice. She said that on the night of the incident, she had been sitting in the security room and had watched the original recording before it disappeared. She said she had copied an 11-second segment onto her phone because she couldn't believe what she was seeing. She said she had kept it for weeks and hadn't dared show it to anyone because her legal residency documents were tied to her job at the hotel and were due for review the following month. Then she looked around the room, at all the waiting faces, and spoke her final words in a breaking voice. You are all believing the footage you were given, she said. But in the 17th frame after Mrs. Rowe lost her balance, Miss Vance reached behind her head. She didn't push her down. She kept her head from striking the stone floor. Those 11 seconds were projected onto the large screen at the far end of the grand hall, and the entire room watched them 3 times in absolute silence. On the third viewing, when the image froze at the exact moment the right hand opened behind the head of the falling woman, a glass tipped over at one of the tables, and no one bothered to pick it up. Then, Emmett Castellano stepped down from the speaking platform. He passed Priscilla, who was still standing with the open file in her hands. He didn't stop this time, just as he hadn't stopped the time before. He walked straight into the center aisle and entered the empty space that 300 people had just created around Rosalind Vance. He stood beside her, facing the room. He took the file from his older sister's hands. She didn't try to pull it back. He closed it, placed it on the nearest table, and rested his hand on top of it. I know what is in here, he said. I also know what is missing. Then he brought his right hand to his left and began removing the leather glove. He did it slowly, one finger at a time, before 300 people, 4 newspapers, and 4 uniformed police officers standing at the far end of the room. The glove fell onto the table. He raised his left hand to shoulder height, palm turned outward, uncovered. In 20 years, the city of Chicago had never seen that hand. 7 years ago, I was 27 years old, he said, and I had agreed to testify before a federal grand jury about the things my family had done over the course of 30 years. No one in the room breathed. The night before the hearing, he said, I was taken to a warehouse in Gary, Indiana. There was an iron door, and it couldn't be opened from the inside. That night, a fire started inside the warehouse. He paused for one beat. 2 other adults had been taken there with me, he said, and there was a 21-year-old woman working the night shift as a nursing assistant at a nearby facility. Someone who had nothing at all to do with my family's affairs, someone who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time and was detained because she had seen too much. He turned his head toward the woman standing beside him. She was the only person who managed to open that door from the inside, he said. She made it out. She was already outside, and beyond the building was the main road, and she could have run. He raised his left hand a little higher. She went back 3 times, he said. The first time, she pulled me out. I could no longer walk, and she carried my weight on her left shoulder for 20 meters. The second time, she went back inside and brought out another person. He stopped, and this time the silence lasted longer. The third time, she was too late, he said. At table number 7, a 74-year-old woman raised both hands to cover her mouth. And this is what I need everyone in this room to understand clearly, Emmett said. For the past 7 years, this woman has remembered the third time more clearly than the other two. That is what she has carried with her. Not the 2 people she saved, the person she couldn't save. He lowered his hand. That file contains 7 empty years, he said. It doesn't tell you that those years are empty because if they weren't, she wouldn't still be alive today. It contains a death certificate. It doesn't tell you who signed it or why. And in the center of the room, a 71-year-old man placed both hands on the table and rose to his feet. Dr. Ansel Whitfield needed a moment to stand fully upright. His thick glasses slid down the bridge of his nose, and he didn't adjust them. I signed it, he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it reached every corner of the room, because the room was as silent as a church. I was the emergency physician on duty on the night of March 19th, 2019, he said. I wrote the time of death and the cause on that document, and I signed my name at the bottom while that woman was lying in the room behind me, still breathing. And Judson Hark made sure the official police report matched my signature before anyone asked for an autopsy. We broke our oaths together to save an innocent life. I practiced medicine for 30 years, and that was the only time I ever lied. He raised one trembling hand and pointed toward the far end of the room, and he spoke his final words to the 4 police officers standing there, not to anyone else. If you need to arrest someone, arrest me, he said. I am 71 years old, and every Tuesday I spend 4 hours sitting in a hospital. I have nothing left to lose, and I don't regret a single second of it. At table number 7, the silver-haired man with the close-cropped cut rose to his feet. Judson Hark had remained silent throughout the evening, just as he had remained silent throughout the evening before, and now he stood before a crowd for only the 3rd time in his life. I drove that car, he said. I served as a police officer for 30 years, and that night I drove her out of the state of Indiana in a car without license plates, and I swore to myself that I would never speak her name. He turned toward Rosalind. The night before last, I sat in my kitchen until morning, he said, because I watched someone slap you right in front of me, and all I managed to say were 3 words. I kept that promise for 7 years, and I believed keeping a promise meant I was doing the right thing. Then the elderly woman at table number 7 stood. Corinne Delacroix Ashby didn't brace herself against the table. She rose upright with a strength no one believed she still possessed. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She tried a second time. My son, she said, and then she had to stop. My son was the person, she said, and once again she stopped. The entire room waited for her. Not one person urged her to continue. In the end, she managed to speak only one complete sentence, and she spoke it to Rosalind, not to anyone else. You went back for him, she said. For 7 years, I believed no one had gone back for him at all. The police captain stepped forward from the back of the room, and he removed his hat before speaking, a small gesture that everyone in the hall noticed. He stopped 2 steps away from Rosalind Vance and addressed her as ma'am. It was a word that the 300 people in that grand hall hadn't given her all evening, hadn't given her in 22 months, and now it was spoken by the only person in the room who didn't know her. Ma'am, he said, are the statements presented here accurate? Rosalind didn't answer at once. She stood there for a long time, long enough for people to begin hearing the rain tapping against the tall windows, steady and unending. And later, when they told the story of that night, most of them remembered that silence clearly. She looked down at the granite floor she had cleaned 6 nights a week. Then she raised her head. Accurate enough, she said. Priscilla Castellano Rowe remained where she was, her hands empty now. She had heard everything, had watched the hand missing 2 fingers rise before 300 people, had listened as a 71-year-old doctor and a former police chief stood one after the other, and inside her mind, something was struggling to reclaim the place it had once occupied. If it is true, she said, and her voice was no longer sharp but faltered in the middle of the sentence. If all of that is true, then why would someone like her clean floors? Why? She could do anything. People would pay any price. Why the bucket and the mop? Rosalind turned to look at her, and what silenced the room wasn't the answer, but the look itself, because there was no hatred in the gray eyes resting on Priscilla Castellano Rowe. If there had been hatred, everything would have been far easier for everyone to bear, because for 7 years, I lived under a name that wasn't mine, Rosalind said. Do you know what that feels like? It is hearing someone call and not being allowed to turn around. It is needing half a second to think before answering the simplest question in the world. She spoke slowly, without raising her voice. Then, 2 years ago, I was allowed to hold my real name again, she said, and I held it with a floor mop. You believed you were humiliating me. You didn't know that every night I walked through the employee entrance of this room, I silently gave thanks that I still had work to do, that I still had a name to write on a timesheet, that I still had a place where people called me by my true name, and I was permitted to turn around. You stood here believing you were taking away my dignity. You couldn't take it. You only showed this entire room how much of your own you possessed. Priscilla couldn't speak. Then Rosalind reached into the pocket of her uniform. She took out a sheet of paper folded into quarters, softened along the creases from being opened and closed too many times. This is what I spent 2 years searching for, she said. She unfolded it. She said it was a copy of a payment order issued by a charitable foundation bearing the Castellano family name, dated March 14th, 2019, 5 days before the night in Gary. She said that on the final line of the document was the signature of the authorized person who approved the payment. And that signature didn't belong to Emmett Castellano. It belonged to Priscilla, used to hire the shadowed fixer on the phone 7 years ago, the very man who had fled the city the moment he recognized the scar. She said that throughout the 2 years she had worked at this hotel, she had believed she would find a different name, and she had spent those 2 years preparing herself for it. Then she raised the paper, 300 heads lifted with it, and Rosalind Vance looked toward the far end of the room. There, behind the last row of chairs near the corridor exit, stood a girl of about 14. She didn't step forward. She didn't step back. Her mother's coat was still draped over her arms, just as it had been from the beginning of the evening, held in the way a child held something after being told to stand there, wait, and not go anywhere. Rosalind looked at the girl for exactly 3 seconds. Then she lowered her hand. She folded the paper again along its old creases. Once, then twice, carefully. The way someone folded something they had carried for a very long time. No one in the room understood what was happening. She took 2 steps toward the police captain and handed him the paper. I have one request, she said. He took it. Handle this privately, Rosalind said. No press, no names in tomorrow's newspapers. If you need me to testify, I will. At any time, as many times as necessary. But I am asking that this be handled behind closed doors. One of the 4 newspapers at the back of the hall began to protest. The captain raised one hand, and they fell silent. He looked at the paper in his hand, then at the woman in the gray uniform standing before him. Do you understand what you are giving up? He asked. You have the right to be publicly cleared. 300 people here just watched you being accused in front of cameras. Rosalind nodded once. I came here to reclaim 7 years of my life, she said. I counted every month, but if the price of those 7 years is that another child must grow up in darkness, then I no longer need them. She didn't look toward the back of the room a second time. She didn't show anyone what she had seen. And perhaps among the 300 people standing inside the Aldermere Grand Hall that night, only 3 understood why she had done it. And one of those 3 was Priscilla Castellano Rowe, who had just raised a hand to cover her mouth and turned toward the far end of the room, where her daughter stood with her mother's coat draped over her arms. Priscilla Castellano Rowe was taken out through the back door, not because the police wanted to preserve her dignity, but because her daughter was standing at the far end of the room, and the captain had seen that at the same moment Rosalind did. They led her through the service corridor, past the kitchen, and out through the loading entrance, along the same route taken every night by the people in gray uniforms. Not a single camera followed her. Not one reporter ran after her. And that was what finally broke her. For 20 years, Priscilla had lived through the eyes of others, measuring her worth by the number of heads that turned when she entered a room, and now she was walking through a service corridor without anyone caring enough to watch her leave. She stopped once at the door and turned around, searching the crowd behind her for the face of her younger stepbrother. Emmett Castellano stood in the center of the grand hall. He looked at her, and he said only one sentence, not loudly, but clearly enough for those nearest him to hear. This began the moment you decided that another human being existed beneath you, he said. Then the door closed. Inside the grand hall, people began approaching Rosalind Vance. They came one at a time, without forming a line, without anyone calling the next person forward, and most of them didn't know what they would say until they were standing in front of her. A woman in a blue evening gown said she had been sitting at the third table that night, that she had seen everything, and that she had looked away. A middle-aged man said he had laughed when the napkin fell at Rosalind's feet. He had laughed because everyone around him was laughing, and he had thought about that sound every day since. A young woman held out her phone and said she had recorded the video and posted it online, and now she didn't know what to do. Rosalind listened to all of them. She didn't interrupt anyone. She didn't say it was all right. She didn't say, "I forgive you," because she understood that saying those words now would only allow them to feel relieved sooner than they deserved. She didn't accuse anyone either. She simply stood there and allowed each of them to remain inside the person they had failed to be that night. And that was the fairest punishment she could give them, because it was a sentence they had passed upon themselves. B. Ocampo came last. She said nothing. She only wrapped the young woman in the calloused arms of someone who had worked the night shift for 22 years, and she wept for everyone who had stood there before her and had been unable to cry. When the room had nearly emptied, Emmett came to her. He spoke quickly, like a man afraid he would lose his courage halfway through. He told her about a house, not on the West Coast, but here in the city, 10 minutes from the hospital. He told her that every cost of her mother's treatment would be covered for the rest of her life, without conditions. He told her about an education fund in the name of the 9-year-old boy, enough to carry him through college and beyond. He told her about compensation that any lawyer would say was still less than she deserved. Rosalind listened to everything. Then she looked at him for a long time. "I am asking for 2 things," she said. "First, Beatriz Ocampo keeps her job and her shift for as long as she wishes to remain. Second, Noor Haddad receives help with her residency documents, properly and legally. She gave up something that could have cost her everything, even though she owed me nothing." Emmett waited. "Is there anything else?" he asked. "No," she replied. He didn't ask a second time. He walked with her to the place where the service corridor began, where the red carpet ended and the concrete floor started, where the chandelier light couldn't reach. There, he stopped. "If the entire city knows your name tomorrow morning," he said, "they will never look at you the same way again." Rosalind placed one hand on the push bar of the door. Then she turned and looked at the room behind her, a room filled with wealthy people who had finally become quiet enough to hear something true. "Never mistake a silent person for a powerless one," she said, "and never mistake humble work for a small life. Dignity is what you keep when no one is applauding. Real strength is what you use to shield others, not what you use to hold them down." Then she pushed the door open and stepped into the rain. No bodyguards followed her. No cameras waited outside. There was only the wet street, the yellow light falling across the water, and a woman in a gray uniform walking toward the bus stop as she had done every night for the past 22 months. She reached the 4th-floor apartment shortly before 3 o'clock in the morning. The 9th stair still creaked. Inside, the dialysis machine sounded with its steady rhythm beside the window, and her mother was breathing deeply in her sleep. On the small bed in the corner, the 9-year-old boy lay on his side, one hand beneath his cheek, the other loosely holding the worn copper coin. Rosalind pulled the blanket over him, sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time in 7 years, she remained still inside her own home without having to think about the door. A person's worth isn't found in the clothes they wear or the job written on their payroll record, but in what they choose to do when no one is watching. Some people spend their lives bending down to clean the floors, others walk across, and they are the ones standing higher than everyone else. Some heroes are never named, never applauded, and never given a single line in the newspaper, and they still go back a 3rd time. If tonight's story has touched something in your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share this video, so that each day you can discover more stories that are truly worth hearing. We would deeply appreciate knowing how you feel about Rosalind, about the people who remained silent in the grand hall that night, and about what you believe you would have done if you had been standing there. Please leave a few words in the comments below, because we truly want to hear the feelings that come from the deepest part of your heart. We wish you and your family abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity every day. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in the next story.